We all think ancient treasures are the stuff of legends and bedtime stories. Buried gold, lost kingdoms, mythical vaults sealed away for eternity. But what if I told you that archaeologists discovered an actual handwritten list, carved into a real scroll, that describes the exact locations of dozens of hidden treasures buried somewhere in the ancient world? And the crazy part is that no one has ever found a single item from that list. Not one coin, not one jar, not one piece of gold. If the scroll is genuine, then somewhere beneath the deserts and hills of the Middle East, there are caches of treasure worth billions of dollars, still sitting exactly where they were left more than 2,000 years ago. And our inability to find any of it raises a question that no expert has been able to fully answer. The Copper Scroll. The Copper Scroll was discovered in 1952 inside a cave near the Dead Sea in what is now the West Bank. Unlike the other Dead Sea Scrolls, which were written on leather or papyrus and contained religious texts, this one was different from the moment it was found, because it was made entirely of copper. Thin sheets of the metal hammered flat and engraved with a long, detailed inscription that had survived for nearly 2 millennia in the dry cave air. And the moment researchers managed to cut it open and read what was inside, the entire archaeological world stopped, because this was not a religious document at all. It was a treasure map. The scroll listed 64 separate locations. Each one described a place where something valuable had been hidden. Gold bars, silver vessels, coins, sacred oils, and containers of incense. The total amount, if you add up every item described in the text, reaches an almost impossible figure. Some estimates suggest it could be worth over $1 billion in today's terms. And yet, despite decades of searching, not a single item from the list has ever been recovered. Every expedition has come back empty-handed. Every translation attempt has produced new debates, and every proposed location has turned out to be either inaccessible, already disturbed, or simply not there. What makes the Copper Scroll even more gripping is that the writing style is unlike anything else found among the Dead Sea Scrolls. The language is a colloquial form of Hebrew, practical and direct, almost like instructions written by someone who simply wanted the reader to follow directions rather than contemplate philosophy. And this plain, no-nonsense tone is exactly what makes it feel genuine. Because if someone was going to fabricate a treasure document as a piece of fiction or religious allegory, they would likely have made it far more dramatic and symbolic. Instead, the Copper Scroll reads like a list left by someone in a hurry. Someone who expected to come back for the treasures, but never did. The biggest mystery of all is who hid these treasures and why. Some scholars believe the items belonged to the temple in Jerusalem, hidden just before the Romans destroyed the city in 70 AD. Others argue the quantities are too large to have come from any known historical source, which raises the uncomfortable possibility that this list describes wealth from a community or institution that history has completely forgotten. And until someone actually locates one of the sites and pulls something out of the ground, the Copper Scroll will remain the most tantalizing unsolved treasure hunt in the ancient world. Second, the Moabite Stone. Most people assume that the Bible is the oldest and most important source we have for understanding ancient Israel and its neighbors. But what if I told you that a large stone slab, discovered in the desert of modern-day Jordan, contained a description of the same events recorded in the Bible, written from the opposing side, and that this inscription, carved by a Moabite king more than 2,800 years ago, not only contradicts certain details in the biblical account, but actually celebrates a military victory against Israel in the king's own words? The existence of this stone forces historians to confront a question that goes far deeper than archaeology. It asks us to think about who gets to write history and whose version we choose to believe. The Moabite Stone, also called the Mesha Stele, was discovered in 1868 near the ancient city of Dibon in what is now Jordan. A local man found it lying in the desert, and word of its existence quickly reached European scholars, who immediately recognized that the inscription carved across its surface was something extraordinary. The stone was commissioned by Mesha, king of Moab, and it described his military campaigns, his construction projects, and most importantly, his revolt against the kingdom of Israel. What made this immediately significant was that the Bible described a very similar conflict in the second book of Kings, making this one of the oldest known inscriptions that directly overlaps with a biblical narrative. The details on the stone were both fascinating and unsettling for those who had always assumed the Bible provided the only reliable record of this period. Mesha described how the god Chemosh had commanded him to drive out the Israelites who had occupied Moabite territory. He spoke of capturing cities, killing their inhabitants, and dragging Israelite sacred objects before his own god as offerings. The tone was triumphant, the language was personal, and the confidence of the king's voice leaped off the stone in a way that made the past feel suddenly very close. Here was a foreign king telling his own story in his own words, completely unconcerned with how it might look from the Israelite perspective. One of the most debated aspects of the Mesha Stele is a section of the inscription that some scholars believe mentions the House of David. The same phrase found on another famous inscription called the Tel Dan Stele. If this reading is correct, it would mean that two separate inscriptions from two different kingdoms both acknowledge the existence of the Davidic dynasty within decades of the events described. But the relevant section of the Moabite stone is damaged and partially destroyed, making the reading uncertain and the debate ongoing. And this single damaged line has become one of the most argued over pieces of text in all of biblical archaeology. What the Mesha Stele ultimately reminds us is that ancient history was always told by more than one voice. Every great conflict had a winner and a loser, and each one told the story differently. The stone sits today in the Louvre in Paris, and it continues to challenge and complicate the way we understand one of the most studied regions in human history. Third, the Tel Dan Stele. Skeptics argued that the biblical figure of King David was nothing more than a mythological invention, a legendary hero created by later writers to give ancient Israel a glorious origin story. There was no hard physical evidence, no inscription, no foreign record that mentioned his dynasty by name. And then, in 1993, a team of archaeologists digging at a site in northern Israel pulled a broken fragment of black basalt out of the ground. And carved into its surface were words that changed the entire argument almost overnight, because those words contained a reference to the House of David, written by an enemy king in a foreign language, centuries before modern scholars had ever begun debating whether David was real. The Tel Dan Stele was discovered at the site of ancient Dan in northern Israel, a city that sat near the border between the ancient kingdoms of Israel and Aram, which roughly corresponds to modern-day Syria. The inscription was written in Aramaic and appears to have been set up by an Aramaean king to celebrate his military victories over neighboring kingdoms. The stone had been broken into pieces at some point in antiquity, and archaeologists found the fragments in secondary use, meaning they had been reused as building material by later inhabitants of the site. But when the pieces were assembled and the inscription was read, the phrase that appeared, translated as House of David, sent shockwaves through the academic world. This was the first time in history that an inscription from outside the Bible had mentioned the ruling dynasty of Judah by name. Until that moment, critics of the biblical account had a reasonable argument. They could point to the absence of any external evidence and suggest that David and his descendants were fictional. The Tel Dan Stele destroyed that argument instantly, because here was a hostile foreign king, writing in his own language for his own people, casually referring to the kingdom of Judah by the name of its founding dynasty. The mention was not celebratory or reverent. It was simply a geographic and political label, which is exactly the kind of reference that proves a tradition was already ancient and well established by the time the stone was carved. The debates that followed the discovery were intense, and in some cases, personal. A small number of scholars pushed back hard, arguing that the phrase could be read differently or that the inscription was a forgery. But the overwhelming consensus among specialists was that the Tel Dan Stele was genuine, that the language was consistent with the period, and that the phrase really did say what most researchers believed it said. And over time, as additional fragments were found and the inscription was studied more carefully, the case for authenticity only grew stronger. What the Tel Dan Stele offers is something rare and precious in ancient history. It offers a moment of external confirmation, a point where the written record from one culture reaches across the centuries and unexpectedly touches the story preserved in another. And in doing so, it reminds us that even the most debated figures in history can leave footprints in places no one thought to look. Fourth, the Black Obelisk of Shalmaneser III. Most ancient sculptures were created to decorate temples, honor gods, or mark graves. But what if one particular monument was designed to do something far more political? To show the entire ancient world, in permanent and undeniable stone, exactly who is in charge. The Black Obelisk of Shalmaneser III is not just a work of art. It is a propaganda tool carved in black limestone, nearly 2 meters tall, and covered from top to bottom with scenes of foreign kings bowing before the Assyrian emperor. And carved into one of those scenes, according to the inscription beside it, is a figure that the Bible identifies as a real king of ancient Israel, making this obelisk one of the most politically and historically charged objects to survive from the ancient Near East. The obelisk was created in the 9th century BC and was discovered in 1846 by the British archaeologist Austen Henry Layard at the ruins of Nimrud in what is now northern Iraq. The ancient city of Nimrud had been a major Assyrian capital, and Layard's excavations there produced some of the most spectacular finds of the 19th century. But nothing grabbed attention quite like the Black Obelisk, which arrived in London and almost immediately became one of the most talked about objects in the newly established collection at the British Museum. The obelisk depicts 5 different rulers bringing tribute to Shalmaneser III, the Assyrian king, and each register of images is accompanied by a cuneiform inscription explaining who the figures are and what they are offering. One of those rulers is named in the text as Iowa, son of Omri, a name that most scholars identify as Jehu, king of Israel, the very same Jehu described in the second book of Kings. The scene shows a bearded figure in a distinctly non-Assyrian robe, prostrating himself before Shalmaneser, with attendants behind him carrying gifts. If this identification is correct, then this is the oldest known image of a biblical figure, carved during or near his own lifetime. Not an illustration, not an artist's imagination, a near-contemporary portrait carved by people who had actually seen him, or at least knew what tribute from his kingdom looked like. What makes the obelisk so compelling beyond its visual impact is the story it tells about power and submission in the ancient world. For Shalmaneser, the monument was a declaration of dominance, a permanent record of every kingdom that had bent the knee before Assyria. For Jehu, the act of sending tribute and bowing before a foreign king represented a dramatic political reversal, because the Bible describes Jehu as a fierce and violent leader who seized power through bloodshed. Yet here he was, kneeling before the greatest military power of his age, perhaps calculating that survival required humility, even when pride demanded otherwise. Today the Black Obelisk stands in the British Museum in London, and it continues to draw visitors who come to stare at the rows of tiny carved figures, imagining the world those people inhabited, and the negotiations, wars, and desperate compromises that brought an Israelite king to his knees before an Assyrian emperor. Fifth, the Ishtar Gate. Almost every ancient structure that once stood at the heart of a great civilization is gone. Burned, buried, collapsed, or carried away stone by stone over centuries. But one of the most magnificent gates ever built in the ancient world still exists, and not entirely in its original form, but reassembled piece by piece, tile by tile, in a museum in Berlin. The Ishtar Gate was the eighth gate of ancient Babylon, and it was so breathtaking in scale and decoration that it has to be seen in person to fully comprehend. And the story of how it ended up in Germany, separated from the ruins of a city that once ruled most of the known world, is itself a remarkable tale of archaeology, ambition, and the complicated ethics of moving history from one continent to another. The Ishtar Gate was constructed during the reign of Nebuchadnezzar II in the 6th century BC, the same Babylonian king described in the Bible as the destroyer of Jerusalem and the captor who sent the Israelites into exile. Babylon at that time was the largest and most powerful city on earth, and the gate was designed to reflect that status. It stood at the entrance to the city's inner walls and formed part of a processional way used during religious festivals. The gate was covered entirely in glazed bricks of deep blue, and across its surface marched rows of animals in relief. Bulls representing the storm god Adad, and dragons representing Marduk, the chief god of Babylon. The effect was overwhelming, a wall of shimmering blue animal figures stretching high above the heads of anyone approaching the city. German archaeologist Robert Koldewey began excavating the site of ancient Babylon in present-day Iraq, starting in 1899, and over the following years his team carefully removed thousands of glazed brick fragments from the ruins of the gate. The pieces were shipped to Berlin, and between 1930 and the early years that followed, the gate was painstakingly reassembled inside the Pergamon Museum, where it stands today. The reconstruction rises to a height of nearly 14 meters and stretches across a room large enough that visitors often fall silent when they walk through the entrance and find themselves standing before the wall of blue and gold. The effect it was designed to produce, awe and submission, still works more than 2,500 years after it was built. But the gate's presence in Berlin has not been without controversy. The government of Iraq has repeatedly requested the return of Babylonian artifacts, and the Ishtar Gate sits at the center of that broader argument about who owns the ancient past. German officials and museum authorities have maintained that the gate is better preserved and more accessible to global audiences in Berlin than it would be in its country of origin, while Iraqi scholars and cultural authorities counter that the removal of such objects strips the people of their own heritage and history. This debate has no clean resolution, and the gate continues to stand in its European home, magnificent and contested, a monument to both the greatness of ancient Babylon and the complicated legacy of the age of excavation. What the Ishtar Gate ultimately represents is the ambition of a civilization at the peak of its power, a civilization that built something so beautiful and so permanent that even its destruction was not enough to erase it. The bricks survived beneath the earth for 25 centuries. They survived the journey to Berlin. They survived 2 world wars that damaged the museum that holds them. And they continue to stand today, patient and blue, waiting for those who visit to remember and reflect, waiting for the argument about where they truly belong to finally be resolved.